before. For others who are new, welcome. Our sort of format is that we will have about 45 minutes of discussion between myself and my two guests. And after that, we'll have a little short break where you can get a drink, because we think that's quite important. We want to create that salon vibe, so you need to get a drink. And in the second half, the conversation will continue, but it will take as its starting point your questions. So do be thinking about what you want to ask in the conversation. And of course, also in that second half, the conversation can broaden. So we can go off on little tangents as long as they're related to the main theme. Let me introduce my guests first of all. To my immediate right is Myisha Cherry, who's visiting from the University of California at Riverside, where she's also the director of the Emotion and Society Lab. Now, her research and writing lies at the intersection of moral psychology and social and political philosophy, and in particular interest in the role of emotions and attitudes in public life. Her books include The Case for Rage, Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle, and most recently, The Failures of Forgiveness. We have a few copies of both for sale. I'm going to be your bookseller in the interval, so do come along and snap one of those up then or at the end, and I'm sure Myisha will be happy to sign. She also hosts the excellent Unmuted podcast, one more thing to put on your feeds. We were also joined by Joanna Burch-Brown. She's a senior lecturer here at Department of Philosophy, University of Bristol. She writes and teaches on contested heritage, reducing prejudice, black philosophical thought and environmental ethics. Now, interestingly, she works collaboratively with institutional leaders, community-based partners.
Sound system's gone.
Sound system's gone? Gone, or I'm just not picking up on it? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. All right, let me try. I think we have to have the microphones pretty close to our mouths, people, so let's really talk into them like that. Got me now? Okay, good. She's involved in the Bridging Histories project, which we'll talk about later. We'll find out more about that. And is also serving on the Bristol History Commission. Interestingly enough, her official university biography tells us that in 2003, she founded a therapeutic horticultural project in London, and that is still going? Mm-hmm. I think that's very interesting. People of many parts. Anyway, that's a little welcome then to Myisha and Joanna. Now, we're here to talk about the role of what might be often thought of as negative emotions and their constructive use in politics. Now, the first question I was going to ask was, the timing of this event is quite extraordinary. We kind of knew it was going to be a couple of days after a very significant election, and we were also aware that would probably evoke some feelings. Now, I'm going to ask a question, we've got a meta question about my question before you answer the question, right? I was going to kind of ask, how do you feel about the result of the election? Now, we can ask that question, but often in situations like this, we might also ask, what do you think about the election? And I'm just wondering, before you actually answer that question, what do you think of the difference between those two questions? And in a sense, I think my understanding is that philosophically, for a lot of our recent past at least, the important question would assume to be, what do you think about it? And what you feel about it is just of like psychological interest, but it's not really the nub of it. Do you think those two questions are of equal importance? Do they have different roles? Should we be asking both?
Yeah.
I'll start with you, Myisha.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first question is most important, particularly because I think if you was to ask any American how they feel, they don't have to think twice about that. I think if you ask them what they think, they may need a moment. I think a lot of people are not clear on what they think right now, or probably is not necessarily perhaps concerned about what they think, but what is visceral is about how they feel. So you asked me a personal question, I'm gonna give you a personal response. I feel, and we were talking about this a little bit on the way here, I fear fear. I feel sad. I feel disappointed. So those are the negative emotions. And what I mean by negative emotions is not necessarily the negative feeling, but the negative evaluation. So I'm fearful of a certain kind of threat. That's a negative evaluation. I'm sad about the state of our country. That's a negative evaluation. But in addition to those kind of negative feelings, I also feel love. I feel love in the communities that I'm a part of. In so many ways, I haven't felt immediately connected like this in a very, very long time. I feel hopeful, and not necessarily hopeful in structures and institutions. I have faith in the humanity of individuals. And so it's usually in times like this, times of chaos and upheavals, that we make these large generalizations about who people are. And I can't say with certainty who people are, but I know the people that I'm close to, who they are. And those are the people that I have faith in. And I have faith that we can get through this together. So those are the emotions that I'm torn with. Trying not to feel despair, but accepting the negative side of things, but also embracing the love that I have and the hope that I have. And I think the combination of both those things is kind of the healing and also the motivation that I think we need in a particular political context that we're facing. What do I think? Yeah, I don't think y'all really want to know what I think. I mean, because it's gonna encompass certain kinds of judgments that in some ways, to ask me what I think, usually people will say, so what do you think about the other side? What do you think about Trump voters? What do you think about him as a politician? I am not concerned about them to have thoughts in that particular domain. I'm more concerned about the victims of future policies. And I'm thinking about them. So the thoughts that I have are not these kind of rational, propositional thoughts or whatever. I'm thinking about people. And I'm thinking about the kind of actions that need to be taken to protect people. So that's what I'm feeling, that's what I'm thinking.
Thanks so much. Joanna, I mean, you are from the States as well. Are you still an American citizen?
I am actually, yeah.
And you voted too. How do you sort of react to that double-edged question of how you feel, how you think? Or, which one would you be inclined to answer first? And what about their relative importance?
Well, I think they're just very deeply connected questions. They're not that different from each other. So I think that our feelings that we have, our responses are deeply part of our rationality and our reasoning, so I don't really see them as so separate, really. I think that when we're reasoning, we're using our emotional intelligence partly to reason. So I was shocked by the outcome, because even though I knew it was entirely possible, I was amazed actually by the scale of the victory on Trump's side, and really thrown by that. So I've just had waves of astonishment and fear is a massive part of it, and an awareness that it can be really hard at this kind of moment to see what's really lying ahead, and you think you're kind of picturing it, but the world is so unpredictable. So that is a big, and he's very unpredictable, so that's a big part of it. But I'm so interested to hear your response, because I also feel underneath that a very clear water of confidence, even though my mic has just gone.
Yeah, the mic has just gone. Yeah, okay.
I do feel that there's this steadiness in that you just have to look at the long game. You have to look at the long game. And we're part of a very massive cultural change. Like the recent decades have been massive cultural change, and those things just don't go smoothly. And you're going to really be thrown if you follow every up and down. You know, it's a really, really, really long-term project that we're on that is about progressive change and radical change.
I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about is, and I've heard people say this in kind of like therapeutic settings, but I think one of the reasons why I'm focused on the positive emotions that I was referring to and trying to get all I can get from the negative emotions is because I think one of the things that they want to do is to instill fear in people. I think one of the things that they want to do is to kind of usher in a kind of social death, if not a physical death of people. And I think the most resistant thing that you can do, is to try to recover and take control of your interiority.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, Socrates said this, I got to protect my soul. And part of protecting my soul is using the negative emotions that I feel for a kind of transformation. Part of protecting my soul is using this opportunity to love people that are comrades and trying to have a kind of faith and not knowing what's going to happen, but knowing that I refuse to be a victim, his victim, their victim. And I think that's what my feelings, and I think you talk about kind of the connection between rationality. I think that's what my feelings want to do. I think, if feelings and emotions are about judgments, I think one of the things I can say that my feelings are saying is that I judge that this would not be the end of us, that this would not be our destruction. And so I think my emotions are like, okay, Myisha, what kind of world are you going to create? For 24 hours, I was depressed. That did not feel good. And the only agency, one might say, that I have is to do something with what I have and to reach out to the community members that I know and to try to figure out how are we going to live through this, not die through this, not be a victim of policies, but how can we live and thrive through this? And I think that's what the focus is.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've been struck by, you've each said it in sort of different ways. You talked about the emotions being evaluations, and you said that you don't really see, what you think and what you feel is really properly being separable. Now, I think I just want to sort of dig into that a little bit. Perhaps you can explain a bit about that, because I think is the idea we're looking at here that when we feel emotions, there is always an implicit or explicit judgment. That's why we're feeling them. You're afraid. Why are you afraid? Well, because you believe that certain things will happen that are bad. There's a factual claim there. And your reason is telling you this, right? So when people, but sometimes our emotions involve evaluations which are factually incorrect, right? Mm-hmm. So there are lots of people, perhaps you would say, I would say too, who are fearful of immigration. And so their emotional reaction of fear is based on an evaluation that something terrible is happening at the border. Actually, we're disagreeing about facts and about the way the world is, aren't we, too? Yeah. So is that kind of what you're getting at when you talk about there being evaluations there? And if so, then if we're talking about, our emotions, they're important indicators of, what we're actually judging, yeah?
And that's why I took your question to be two separate questions. And I took the thinking question to be kind of a separate thing, because for me, emotions do entail all that other stuff. So I took the thinking to be, what are you contemplating? Because for me, the emotions is doing that kind of work. And so let me get kind of techie here. So I do think that emotions are evaluations, and we can be wrong about our evaluations of the world. I would say that. But I also think that emotions are loaded with information. Audre Lorde talks about this. Toni Morrison talks about this. So not only do they judge a particular state of affairs, but even if we don't know what's going on, our emotions can give us a certain kind of insight and a certain kind of knowledge. I take that to just be part and parcel of what it is to feel. And thinking sometimes can be opinions. It can be, whatever. I don't necessarily make thinking connected to rationality. But I think embedded in emotions is that evaluation. Embedded in emotions is that kind of information that the world is giving you. And I think going back to the fear thing, I think the reason why I'm not fearful is because, yes, I'm fearful because I judge that these policies are going to be detrimental to a whole bunch of people. But I'm also fearful because I think that the outcome of the election told me more than I wanted to know about what my fellow Americans think about me as a woman, as a person of color. And I didn't need to think about that, right? My emotions of fear, my emotions of despair told me all I needed to know.
Yeah. But I mean, historically, there's been a suspicion of emotions that they were thought to cloud our judgment, interfere with our rationality. Is there something to that worry, or was that just completely misplaced? I mean, what do you think, John?
Well, I was going to come back to the point that when you were setting up that sequence, you were saying, okay, you have a thought, and then you've got an emotional register to that thought. But I think it works the other way as well. So and maybe even more often, the emotional state that you're in then shapes what thoughts you then have, and then that feeds into the emotional state. And I think there's a lot of research, showing that if you can find a kind of that creative states are like generative, positive, you can come up with lots of creative solutions out of certain kinds of emotional states. And that part of kind of being radical is about finding those emotional states in the moments when you need them most. And I've totally forgotten what your actual question
well,
was.
okay. But let me just park the original one, but continue that line of thought. So yes, you're right. It can work in two directions. Your thoughts can give rise to emotions. So you realise Trump is president. Oh my God! And by the way, I should say that I don't want to assume that everyone in this room is anti-Trump. If someone in this room has voted for Trump, then you're welcome, and we do want to hear your views, right? I'm just reflecting about
Not
this.
today,
I want to
though.
be
I can't.
okay. Well, not all of them,
Be
but some.
sensitive,
Not all of them,
please.
but some of them. Be sensitive, yeah. But I mean, we're just being honest about our own views here, right? But yeah, you can have. Often we have emotions in response to facts. Now you're saying it can work the other way around. We can have feelings, and this drives our thinking. I think traditionally that people would be suspicious of that, though, wouldn't they? They say that it's inappropriate for our emotions to be guiding our thinking because the emotions may be justified, they may be reasonable, but they may be irrational. They may be reflecting, like prejudice, for example.
Yeah, when you're saying traditionally, I mean, I guess there's traditional European thought that is very sort of cautious about emotions. But I think, it's one of the things that often people come up with when there's, people are getting emotional about injustices, and they'll say, oh, they're just being carried away on these emotions. But actually, there's an injustice, and the emotion is an appropriate response to that injustice. The anger is an appropriate response to that injustice, and that's one of your main arguments. And that, it seems to me that there's, there can be a momentum to emotional patterns that can take you out, that can be misleading, but no more so than lines of reasoning. Lines of reasoning can be highly, highly misleading.
Yeah.
Philosophers make this mistake all the time, and they go off on lines of argument that aren't answering to the emotions and go completely off the rails. Not that I'm disparaging the discipline.
Yeah. Go on.
So you're absolutely right. So when we're thinking about, we've just talked about, we just agreed upon, that emotions is connected to rationality in the sense that they are judgments or involved with judgments, that they give us knowledge. They have all these what we call kind of epistemic benefits. And so usually people say, okay, I accept that emotions can be rational. But to be emotional is still to be too irrational. So we're going to blame the emotion for one's behavior. And I think, why aren't we blaming the rationality? Why can't we just make the judgment that you just made, Julian, in the sense that you're just wrong about the state of affairs? So there's nothing wrong with the anger. You're just wrong about what you judge to be an injustice. So people have a tendency to kind of like critique emotions. I'm very much concerned with just critiquing the context. Is the emotion fitting or unfitting, right? Does it match the state of affairs? And we can agree or disagree about the state of affairs. We could do that all day. But there's no doubt, let me just make this point about the Trump thing, there's no doubt that there's racism, adamant sexism. There's a policy that's being, whole plan to disenfranchise people, to take people rights. Freedom of press. We know all that to be the facts on the ground, and so those emotions are responding to that. And there's no doubt that we could be wrong. We're wrong about a whole bunch of things, whether that's in referring to emotions or whether that's referring to a whole bunch of things. So yes, there's room for error. There's room for being mistaken. But I think we need to check that on the rationality end and not necessarily on the emotion end.
Let me just give a sort of scenario to check I've got this right. So let's give an example. I mean, unfortunately, a Trump rally, for example, are very emotionally charged affairs. And Trump often says, there's so much love in this room. And I think some people who are not Trump supporters sort of like cringe at that. But actually, there's a sense in which he is right. There is a love in that room for the people in the room and for people that they see as on their side. And there also are things like fear going on. Now, if I'm getting you right, are you saying that when people look at that and say, oh, look, the problem with this is that it's all emotional, right? That's not the problem. The problem is you've got to look at it holistically and see the problem is that underlying all of this are false beliefs, unwanted prejudices, etc. Don't blame the emotion. The emotion is a kind of it's not because people are emotional that they're believing these wrong things. it's more kind of integrated than that. Is that kind of right?
That is kind of right.
Yeah.
And we have a tendency to just look at it in the emotional part and not looking at the judgments that's being made. So I agree with you, Julian, that Trump is not wrong about it being love. So even he said that the storming of the Capitol was an act of love. And he says that what happened, the rally at Madison Square Garden, which was heavily, explicitly racist and xenophobia, was love. Yeah, that's love in the sense of loving white supremacy and loving superiority. So let's be very clear about the targets. Yes, it's love, but we can also love slavery. We can love domination. We can love oppression. So more needs to be said of exactly what that love is. So he is right, it is love, but it's not the kind of love that we think of when we talk about agape, for example, or we talk about philia. It's not that kind of love. It's not that inclusive love. It's not that liberatory love. It's a very exclusive love that's based on domination and oppression.
Can I focus a little bit on your previous book was called The Case for Rage, and I think that probably you probably sold everyone already on the idea that yes, emotions have a proper role to play. They're connected with our rationality. Very intense emotions like rage and anger. I mean, I think, again, our culture has been particularly suspicious of those, right? So before I question it anyway, why do you think even an emotion like that is actually important? Why is it important to be angry, to have rage sometimes?
Well, it's a response to injustice. And according to the social movement record, that people don't wake up one day and decide, you know what, I've been dominating people for a very long time. I should stop doing that. What we know is that it's always been at the grassroots, and where the oppressed have said, we're not taking this no more. We judge that an injustice is occurring. We're going to use this anger that we have at the injustice and protest and demand that things change. Right? So I think one of the roles that anger plays is that it motivates us, particularly allows us to see the world for what it is, right? A world of injustice. And then it motivates us to kind of change the state of affairs, whether that's making demands of people or allowing us to use the resources that we have to do what we have to do to change things. And so this the history of social movements, even the social movements that we have a tendency to paint with love, that is the civil rights movement of the United States. And I mentioned this in my book. People don't know that, like, Martin Luther King was also angry. The letter from a Birmingham jail was written out of anger in his cell. So when he tries to get members, young people that's gearing towards the Black Power movement, when he's trying to galvanize them to kind of join the civil rights movement, he doesn't tell them to let go of their anger. He basically says, join our movement so you can channel it in these particular directions. So we know just the history of like liberation change always comes about because people say, what's happening is not right. We got all this fire, all this collective energy, and we're going to use it in order to bring about change. So we know just empirically that it works. But we also know, like just from neuroscience, that when you're angry, 3 things happen. It increases your optimism, so you believe things can change. Mm-hmm. It increases your self-belief, so you believe that you can change things. And it also makes you risk averse. So it makes you willing to do whatever you can to change things. Now that can, if your anger is inapt, like January 6th, we can see how that can look like, right? You can storm the Capitol, right? But if your anger is directed towards justice for all people, then you can do what Martin Luther King did. You can do what Ida B. Wells did and all civil rights leaders did. So that's what I see as the role of anger. It can motivate us, recognize injustice, challenge the powers that be, do what we need to do in order to change things. And it has this motivational force, not just logically, but just empirically, we know that to be the case when we are angry.
So that's the case for rage in a nutshell. But Joanna, I mean, obviously you some of the projects and things you're involved with in Bristol are to do with historical injustices. Now, the skepticism people have of this is that the whole premise here is that we can channel our anger, we can direct it in the right way. Now, there's, again, a long tradition in Western thought of saying you're playing with fire when you do this, because actually what experience tells us is that often these things create their own momentum. So for every person who uses anger and rage and directs it well and properly, there are people who just end up, looting, burning things down, sometimes burning cars that turn out to be their neighbours, not even the enemies. They're storming the Capitol, whatever it might be. So, I mean, is there something to the idea that, we are playing with fire if we say anger, thumbs up, do you feel that concern?
Okay, so I want to come back to Letter from Birmingham Jail because I think this is such a powerful testimony. I mean, so, what he says there, what King says there is that there is a necessary tension. So there's a necessity for tension. You've got to, there won't be change if you don't create this sort of social tension. And the reality is that the anger is there already. People are angry because they're experiencing injustices. And the real danger here is that people who are in positions of power, who have maybe power that they don't understand they're exercising, that is bureaucratic power, are not feeling the effects of the consequences of the injustices that they're part of. It's the lack of anger there that is the danger. Right, not the anger. I mean, so I'm actually quite, I'm often concerned that people can get carried away on waves of anger and can start lashing out at anything and everything. So yes, I have that concern, but I think it can be a distraction from the fact that there's profound injustice that is maintained day in, day out in the form of really oppressive bureaucratic systems that damage the lives of people unjustly, that marginalize people, that exclude people, that put up barriers at every turn somebody tries to improve their situation. And the absence of anger over that is the real threat.
I also would say, anger is not the boogeyman. Like we're individuals, we're humans, we have agency, we make decisions. And, as you mentioned love, if love was in the room, as they purport, then we should have a problem with love, right? If love can make them say those things, why isn't anyone critiquing love, right? I mean, so you might say, well, come on, Myisha, that's the extreme form of love. But even I know some people who are really in love, and they need an intervention, right? So, as much as we want to get on anger, all our emotions can go awry. I mean, that's why Aristotle says, a virtue is the mean between two extremes, that we can take anything and be extreme with it. But mind you, I said we can take anything, not the boogeyman of emotions can take anything. We still have agency. We can still, decide. There's still deliberation that happens. And so anger doesn't make you do anything. It can motivate you, but you need to act off the motivation. And I think that's a complete human story, right? So there's agency that we have. Emotions are not passions in the sense that they just come upon us and there's nothing that we can do. There's still deliberation, there's still agency that's involved here. So yeah, let's not blame anger for all the things.
I like the fact you brought in Aristotle. I always like that. So Aristotle, you would say of any emotion, it's not right or wrong in itself. It's having the right degree at the right time, directed at the right person, etc., etc. And as you say, it's the means. So you can be too angry, but you can also be not angry enough.
Yep.
If you're not remotely angry about injustice in the world, then you're probably not paying attention. But love is the same. You can not love enough, but you can love too much. You can love something too much, so you're neglecting other things that are more important. So that's really important. I want to, time is really going fast here. I want to bring up a few things that relate to your Bridging Histories project that you're involved in, Joanna. So could you, as briefly as you could, first of all, what is the Bridging Histories project?
Thanks for asking. It's the most fun thing I've ever done. It's totally beautiful. So we just invite anybody anywhere to join in these 6 creative activities. So we ask people, we wander around, we interview people, we chat with people, we run events. We ask people to write poems where they every line starts I am from, and then you express yourself. To share a recipe and a story to go with that. To share a street history, so is there a street that's special and why is it special? To share a story from family history. The 5th one is to share the memory of somebody who you want to honor. And the 6th one is to share what it is that you're doing to make a positive change, whether that's in your own personal life or in the world around you. And that has kind of space for you to connect with past, present, and future. It has, it gets people talking about themselves, but it prompts them to think about things that they're not usually talking about. So it gets you outside of your usual sort of story line about yourself and gets you to sort of think, oh yeah, I remember something. And then that just broadens the kind of resources, the emotional resoures.
So people are thinking and feeling differently as a result. Now, the
Yes.
other thing I wanted to ask about was the Bristol History Commission, right?
Mhm.
Because this comes out of some quite contentious stuff. It keeps going. Oh, we're back again. Right, so tell us about that, the Bristol History Commission.
Yes, the History Commission was set up by the Mayor of Bristol when
We had one.
when the Colston statue came down. And his initial idea was that he wanted a group of academics who were going to look at the history of the city and try and help kind of come up with a better understanding of it. And I actually wrote to him and said, I don't think this is the right structure to be using to address this problem. This is fundamentally about belonging and identity and self-determination and people needing to feel like their story is being heard and welcomed, that their story is part of the story of the city. And it really doesn't have to do with academics. So he said, I'm going to keep the structure as it is, but please join the commission and you can do something from within that. So then I thought, well, we spent several months looking at different issues, but I was kind of just chewing over the idea of what should, how do we actually kind of fulfill this purpose, the potential purpose of the History Commission. And I went to a hypnotherapist who I like to go to when I have a creative problem to solve, and I went into the creative unconscious and came up with that sequence of 6 prompts as a way of...
So, I mean, because the issues that arise from that, I'm just interested, obviously, you're all from Bristol, Myisha's been here about 12 hours, but, Bristol is a history which, is a city which has a history which is very deeply embedded with slavery. Not only was it where John Cabot set off to, discover, in inverted commas, the New World, tobacco, there's just a slave trade, indeed, in Bristol. Colston was involved in the slave trade. His statue was brought down, and this is something which a lot of people feel the city hasn't kind of quite come to terms with. There are still legacies of this in the structures of the city, in the inequalities of the city. Now, again, some people might say that the way in which we get through this is to have as cool and calm a debate as possible, which is maybe true. But to what extent is it important to not just acknowledge, but to sort of embrace the emotional dimensions of this, do you think? And have your views, because this also relates, Bristol is not unique in this, you'll have experience of this as well. What do you think about it? Why should we be concerned with the emotional aspects of this, as well as, sort of just thinking about what the just settlement might be, for example?
I'll just throw a different perspective into this. So when we were doing the Countering Colston campaign, this was in 2015 to 2020. And one thing that was amazing, we would do something simple like chalking outside of the cathedral when the Colston's Girls' School students came. Because it used to be that Colston's Girls' School, the students would have an annual ceremony where everybody would read passages, passages of Colston's will would be read. They would have to wear his favorite flower, the bronze chrysanthemum, and hear a sermon on the Good Samaritan. And so we were just going outside and saying, do you know who this person is? And then demanding that the cathedral stop hosting such ceremonies or demand that they change. And there would be alumni from previous years of the Colston School, so octogenarians. And I had some amazing conversations with some of those little old ladies who were absolutely quivering, like physically quivering with distress at the fact that we were challenging Colston. But we'd spent a lot of time studying the letters that people had been writing into the Bristol Post to say what they thought should be happening. And so we really understood, because we've been reading these letters, we really understood what people were feeling and thinking and talking about. And so we were able to say, okay, you might be concerned that we're scapegoating Colston when actually there's a much bigger thing. And they'd say, oh yeah, that is. And then they kind of relax a little bit and say, you might be concerned that this is the only injustice and there are other injustices we should be thinking about. They relax a little bit more. And actually by addressing the arguments people had, we didn't come to agreement. So my sense was that often the kind of octogenarians would get to a point where they thought, well, tradition matters, and you need to trust tradition and authority. So there would be a point where you kind of knew you'd gotten to the bedrock of the disagreement, but a lot of the conflict and distress could be resolved by that process.
So again, it seems to me, again, tell me if I'm wrong, it's partly by listening to sort of people's emotions, it's the information those emotions are giving you about them, and that helps you to understand them better and find your points of agreement. I wanted to sort of segue this into the theme of your most recent book, Myisha, is called Failures of Forgiveness. Forgiveness is held up as one of the prime virtues in our culture because it's largely perhaps because of its Christian heritage, and that's the kind of the background of it. When it comes to these issues around, historical injustices, slavery, etc., maybe it's not exactly forgiveness, but I think people think the kind of spirit of forgiveness is that we don't kind of, as people use the phrase, rake over these old injustices. We should let things be. What's happened has happened. We don't have to formally forgive, but we pass over, we move on. Now, I'm assuming you don't think that's a very good idea. But what's wrong with the idea? Let's just forgive the past injustices and move on. And the idea that it's not healthy to sort of insist on kind of feeling we have to resolve them. What do people get wrong when they want to do that?
Yeah, I want to answer your question by also revisiting your last question as well. So I'm thinking about your last question, and two thoughts kind of came to mind. The first question is, I think, the challenge for oppressed people to always respond rationally to something that is irrational at its core, which is racism and domination, is just a tall order. But also I would say that oppression and domination has not only material effects, but psychological and traumatic effects. And to say to the oppressed that you ought not to respond to such oppression with one's psychology, one affective state, which is being attacked, which is being destroyed, is also a tall, irrational order, right? And so one thing about oppression, particularly I just learned today that you all are still paying taxes to slave owners.
Oh no, we finished in 2015.
Oh, you finished in 2015. I mean, can you imagine the psychology, the trauma of doing that every year for enslaved Africans, formerly, descendants of enslaved Africans, right? So there's no doubt that there's going to be psychological responses to psychological oppression, and emotions being one of them, right? That just makes sense. That makes sense. So as far as your question about forgiveness, I mean, let me just say this: you can't forgive anything that. If you're going to forgive or bring up a topic of forgiveness, we got to make sure that what's being forgiven is talked about, because there has to be something that we forgive. For a lot of people, it's much more easier to talk about the topic of forgiveness by sidestepping exactly what is being forgiven. That is so clever. It is genius, and it has worked. I would say that anytime anyone begins to talk about forgiveness but don't want to talk about what's being forgiven, please know that that's an insincere, manipulative kind of move, and I want us to be cautious of it. So I think it's important that we talk about what is being forgiven. You talked about the legacies of slavery or oppression. Another way of saying is there's always an afterlife, and we always have to contend with that. I mean, repairing ourselves from wrongdoing, trying to build another world after wrongdoing is hard work, not only for those who need to be forgiven, but also those who are going to forgive. It's messy work. It's long work. And anytime we try to do it quickly by trying to get over things, it's not going to work. It's going to be a kind of superficial kind of repair that looks good on the outside, but never got to the root. Yeah. And so what you're going to find is people still mad, people still upset, people still dying young. Because things haven't really been necessarily addressed. So I think we need to kind of address what is being forgiven, and you can't quickly go over that. I will also say that it's important, acknowledgement is important for another reason, is because, and studies have been shown, that for a victim, what they most want is people to validate their experiences of whatever that experience is, experience of wrongdoing, experiences of mistreatment, experiences of genocide. And anytime you gaslight them and ignore that experience, it is hard for them to quote unquote move on. And the best thing that we can do as a community is to validate people's experience of wrongdoing. And what that entails is you gotta say what happened. You can't tell them to forgive, you gotta address it. And that's the way that people can actually begin to move forward.
I have to say, I'm not a Christian myself, but I think people sometimes get the Christian teaching of forgiveness wrong here. They think that it's a kind of unconditional thing, that you grant it, like, I forgive you, and you do it like this. I think if you actually read the Gospels carefully, I don't know, what you find is that forgiveness is about the rebuilding of relations, right? And that requires both parties. You can't, so in other words, you can't do forgiveness unilaterally. In order for forgiveness to work, you have to have the other side acknowledge their wrongdoing and then come together. And I think this is interesting because, okay, that's about forgiveness, but I think this I think is something which I get the impression this is an important theme in all issues around historical injustice. So I don't know what you think about this, Joanna, but as a city trying to come to terms with the unpleasant aspects of its past, I mean, do you see this sort of need basically for everyone to kind of recognise the different roles as they've been played in order to say move on? You can't move on until everyone's kind of acknowledged things properly. Is that something you're struggling with or not?
Well, so I think the UN guidelines on transitional justice are relevant. So the UN has guidelines on how societies should proceed if they are addressing histories of mass human rights abuses. And they say that there are 4 rights that descendant communities would have as a result of injustice. So they say there's a right to justice. It's accountability. There's a right to acknowledgement and truth. There's a right to reparation. So that is both symbolic reparation. Don't go out now. Yeah. There's a right to reparation, that's symbolic, and it's material as well. And there's a right to guarantees of non-recurrence.
Right.
And it doesn't say there's an obligation to forgive. It says that these are rights. And when we have histories of huge human rights abuses, which is what we have in the history and legacies of racism and the continuation, we don't have guarantees of non-recurrence right now, because we are continuing to have huge amounts of racially patterned harassment, discrimination, injustice, so when you don't have those guarantees of non-recurrence yet, it's not possible to move into the state of just letting go and reconciling. And this is where institutions think, oh, we're going to take steps towards trying to do things better, and they bring on a couple representatives onto a committee, and it's the people who are convenient to have on a committee, and a lot of the measures that institutions are trying to take right now in no way reach the most marginalized and most excluded communities who really have the claim. And so I think our institutions need to start thinking in radically different ways, because the process of repair needs itself to be a healing process. So I'm much more thinking about those, thinking across all of those different dimensions.
Yeah.
And I think that the latter point is important. I was recently talking to a Rwandan student, and he was basically telling me just about what's currently happening in Rwanda. And if you all know, the genocide occurred, and the question is, okay, how can you continue to live with your neighbors who killed your family? And one of the things that he said to kind of, from the president, to ensure that something like that never happens again, because that's very important for the president, is there's certain kind of steps. You get rid of kind of designations. So you can't say that you're part of one ethnic group over the other, right? And so there's certain things put in place to make sure that something like that never happens again. I would say that. And then another point, and this is more of a corrective, and I wonder if you agree with this, because I don't want to just outright correct you, is that I don't think that we can move on from wrongdoing, because as we just agreed upon, wrongdoing has an afterlife and it has a legacy. That even when we fix it, it's hard to totally heal from the trauma of it all. So I'd rather say, and this doesn't sound good, doesn't sound sunny, but it is the truth, that we don't move from wrongdoing, we move on with wrongdoing.
No, that's a very, very good corrective, and I think people will probably agree that's often true of other kind of personal and psychological traumas as well. You don't get over things and move on from them. You have to find a way of moving into the future, holding those things, but holding them in the right way. So yeah, no, absolutely appropriately corrected. All right, now listen, what we're going to do now is we're going to have a little short break in which you can get yourself a drink. You may also peruse or buy a book. We have a couple of Myisha's books. We've mentioned both of them, Case for Rage and Failures of Forgiveness. Also, there's some of my books here, which have nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but they do make excellent Thanksgiving gifts, and or Christmas if you celebrate that strange festival. But we're going to just take 15, 20 minutes, and so please be back in your seats, but be back in your seats importantly with your own questions. Any thoughts at all that have been sparked by this first part? We really want to just get this conversation moving on in the directions you want to. So in the meantime, interim thanks for the wonderful contributions so far from Joanna and Myisha.